Thanks for everyone for joining this afternoon. We're pretty excited to share with you some of the insights and learnings that we've had from a fair few years of work in this space. And so, yeah, appreciate Warren for you taking some time out of your afternoon and everyone else who's joined the call as well. I've noticed a few people have dialed in from overseas. So again, thank you for your early morning or late night in pajamas as well. So what we're going to cover off today is really an extract from data that we have been working on for the last 3 or 4 years, based on a whole bunch of work which Warren and I will talk to. And what we're trying to do is to unpack some of the data, the key bits of insight, and some of the research with you. And it's underpinned by a white paper which Holly's put into the chat notes as well. So if you haven't got access to the white paper, feel free to download that white paper as well. For those of you who don't know us, just a little quick synopsis of what we do. We've very much been working in the serious injury fatality prevention space for many years. And along the way, we've picked up some really, really passionate and equally energized people with deep industry expertise. And so a number of you on the call may recognize some of the names here. And so big shout out to Trish and Don and Anthony Deacon, and of course Liz, who's also led some of our academic research with Fed Uni as well. And also welcome to Oz. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Alex.
Excellent. So in terms of the kind of work that we've been working on for years, and the premise of the business is that we believe in learning from unplanned events, and the notion that if you could learn from serious events and also understand how work is done in the field, it helps us to enhance and understand how we can improve the effectiveness of controls. So that's kind of the heart and soul of what the business is about. And of course, we use diagnostics, so we tend to rely on data-led strategies to help organisations and clients to better understand their exposure and what they can do to minimise exposure to their people. So the kind of work that we have worked on over the years has been primarily around governance, so governance around classification of incidents. Do leaders and organisations have adequate and reliable data to make decisions on how they help their people? So it's kind of deep diving on validated metrics. We also do a bit of work in controls analysis, so just looking to get a sense of whether people on the front line are enabled to do the work. Have they got the systems, the equipment, the resources to see those controls being as effective as they can? And so we shed light on that through some data analysis as well. We also do a lot of work in causal analysis, so quite often we get involved in high potential incident reviews. We may get involved in looking at repeat serious incidents and trying to better understand how do we improve controls in the field. And then, of course, borrowing your words, Warren, not all controls are equal. And so we do a fair bit of work in terms of reviewing control architectures and getting a sense of whether are the controls as designed as effective in the field. Anything you want to add to that, Warren?
You covered that beautifully, Alex. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. And so just a quick synopsis of what we're looking to cover off. So there is a global research project that's been running for about 3 or 4 years across multiple industries. And so Warren will kind of unpack the demographics of the research and the boundaries of the research, so to speak. We'll dive into the high level findings from the research. And what we found was that there is so much data that it was actually overwhelming for us to kind of summarize it, draw the key insights, and not overwhelm our clients and people on the call, as an example. So what we've done is we've extracted out certain elements of that and going to drip feed that into webinars and white papers. And so you'll see this kind of unfold as the conversation unfolds as well. Baselining language is really important to us. So we tend to use the word serious injury and fatality potential. Some organisations call it hypo, SPI incidents and things like that. So I want to spend a tiny bit of time just giving you an appreciation for our language and of course just calibrating on that as a basis for the subsequent conversation. Jumping deep into the data, so based on the data that we've analysed over multiple projects and the work that we've done, giving you a sense of what we're seeing in terms of patterns and trends in classification and what that means for leaders in organisations. And then, of course, the implication for managing critical risk. So that's kind of what we're going to cover off today. But Warren, over to you. Give us a sense of the research study and what it is and what it isn't that we kind of covered.
Sure, Alex. Thanks for that. Look, as you can see here, quite a few countries have been covered, by our our research activities. We've worked across 12 countries. We haven't actually gone to those 12 countries, or at least not in the last 2 or 3 years, but the incidents have come from a variety of operations. I think about 30 different operational sites across 12 countries. And you can see there that there's a fairly good cross-section of high hazard sectors that we've covered. In fact, it's quite a wide variety. Some of them not quite your classical high risk environments that we would normally immediately jump to think of. So I think we should probably just look at some of the numbers, Alex, that have come from that study.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick check. Am I screen sharing? Because Holly's just put a note in there saying that I may
Yes,
not
you
be
are.
screen sharing. Excellent.
I can see it.
Fantastic. Excellent.
If anybody else can't see it, please tell us now.
Because that would be very helpful for this webinar, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So yeah, look, it was a fairly large study over a number of different clients in different industry sectors. But in terms of the demographics, so to speak, we talk about 10,000 incidents, Warren, that we've analysed, and of course, it's a bit more to it than that, right? So,
sure.
Can you tell us a bit more, like the variation that we saw in those reports and the maturity of organisations and some of the implications around that?
And I think that's why we probably would prefer to refer to those 10,000 as incident reports, because we know that investigations don't necessarily automatically emerge from every incident. And we were looking obviously to tease out real information from incident investigations where possible, because that's where the really good information comes from, and that's where you can make more confident calls. So we had to whittle that 10,000 down by about half just to begin with, on the basis that we really didn't have, or we had quite poor and often quite inadequate information to even make a call about what actually happened. And that's a fairly surprising, kind of outcome from those 10,000 incidents in the first place. But for the 5,000 plus that we did have relatively good information, we extracted another 680 out of that that we felt had pretty credible potential for a serious outcome, a serious potential outcome. And those are the incidents that we've spent more time exploring and doing a deep dive analysis across a range of factors, one of them being what was the classification of the event in the first place. And that's only one of the elements, obviously, but that's the element that we're talking about today. What we have found, just for general takeaways from that, a very large proportion of those incidents that were reported really didn't have enough detail to properly analyse, which is an interesting finding. In fact, I could say that they probably didn't even establish accurately what happened. Where it came to describing how the event sits in those organisations' own taxonomy of incident classification, we're talking about control breaches, injuries, lost time, hazards, near misses, mechanical failures. We found probably at least 1 in 5 weren't actually what the organisation thought it was. And that's kind of fascinating too. What it led to us doing is, rather than just asking for incidents to be given to us to analyse, we said, give us everything. Because we're finding, even in hazard reports, we're finding legitimate incidents existing in hazard reports. And conversely, many incidents were not incidents at all. They were probably hazards or control breaches. The average level of causal analysis in those investigations, I've got to say, was pretty poor. And this wouldn't come as a surprise to most of the people in this webinar. We see a highly variable approach, to depth of investigation, and certainly like the acuity that people use to really try and extract why did this event happen. We're also finding that out of those 5,000 odd investigations, the majority of corrective actions, out of interest, probably wouldn't have made much difference to exposure when you really shine a microscope on them in terms of their potential effect. So, and in case you're curious about that 1,000 plus absent or ineffective controls, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a future webinar. We won't get into that today because that's quite a large discussion all by itself.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for clarifying that, because that's initially where my focus was telling me more about the absent or ineffective controls, and and to your point, there is going to be a deeper webinar on that. To that point, if anyone's got questions around this, because this obviously can trigger off a fair few questions, Please use the webinar chat to drop your questions in there, and what we'll do is we'll do our best to address those questions towards the end of the webinar. But if it's a good prompt for me in conversation, I can actually use them to provide clarity in real time as well. So in terms of the global takeaways of the research, so again, it's a fairly large study, and what we've done is we've distilled our understanding of that work into 6 key takeaways. This webinar is going to dive deeper into number 1, but we thought it might be a benefit to actually share with you, as it does in the webinar, just the high-level takeaways. In the white paper, the high-level takeaways from the work that we've done. So, Woz, do you want to just throw on to these as well?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, just in that first one, we probably could summarise number 1 by simply saying that only 16% of what we would refer to as serious potential events were classified correctly. And we'll talk a lot more about that for the next 30 or 40 minutes, of course, and we'll tease out some of the the subtext of that. Finding 2 was about critical controls, because that's the first question we're asking after, is this thing serious enough for us to really do a deep dive on, is what controls were absent or ineffective or poorly implemented, that if they were in place, would have save this event from even occurring in the first place. We found that 95% of those controls that were relevant to those incidents, were completely reliant upon human behaviour. So very procedural in nature, therefore very, some people would say relatively unreliable. Interesting fact, though, that 63% of those controls, only 63% of those controls were relatively easy to implement for the worker, leaving 37% not so easy at all. So yeah, right. There's a gap there that we'll explore a lot more. Finding 3 was more about human error in serious incidents, and there's always some kind of error. Obviously, it's not necessarily by the worker who's actually got the tool in their hand. Sometimes there's an error that's further upstream, that's occurred, like a maintenance issue. But we found that unintended errors tended to account for about 60% of control failures. We like to use the word workarounds rather than violations, which is the old classic terminology, where people have actually sort of worked consciously outside, the requirements of the task. That's about 40%. And obviously that's got some pretty serious implications for how you would intervene, to address those control failures. Finding 4 was more about operational influences. So we're sort of now starting to pan back a little bit and look at more latent factors. Operational factors aren't that latent, of course, because that's the environment within which the work is being done. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at leadership influence, how it affects worker behaviour, the effectiveness of teamwork, and whether those management processes that affect how risk is controlled in the field are actually working as they're intended. Some really interesting data around what is more likely to be a contributing factor in particular risk situations. And the organisation system session, that's really working now back at the blunt end, that we would, what some people would call the blunt end, or very latent, kind of influences. And with most of these SIFp potential events, there was at least one obvious organisational system issue, like a safety management system issue, or a plant and equipment issue, or a contractor and supplier issue, that sat upstream of those events. And that's a really interesting data set for us to analyse in a future webinar. The last one is about trying to hone in on 2 of the big ticket risks, which are motor vehicle related and gravity related. Now, there's a fair bit going on in both of those. There's lots of different ways for mobile equipment to have issues. And obviously, there's a lot of different ways that a gravity-related concern can occur in the first place. There's at least 3 or 4 risk categories that are bundled up under that. But those are the most likely to contribute to workplace fatalities. As we know from, in fact, fatality frequency data that's produced at a national level and at a global level. We'll delve more deeply into those 2 because we believe it's worth doing so, because there's a lot to learn there.
Excellent. And no doubt there's so much to unpack with the findings, Warren. So what we'll do is we'll focus on number 1 and go a bit deeper. But I just had a question come through, which is around how do we define incidents from a SIFp perspective? So I think that's obviously a great segue for the next slide. And so I think just baselining language is really important. So what one person calls an incident or a near miss or a high potential or an SPI is there's different corporate language, but there's also language that we might use fairly uniquely ourselves. I think mining the diamond is something I found, I think, in some of the larger corporate environments. But so, do you want to walk us through
Sure.
the
I'll
triangle,
try not
looking
to
at the
make this
triangle?
too technical a discussion. And look, I know a lot of people who are on this webinar in the audience know about as much about this as I do, which is great, because it's become quite common language amongst a large cohort of the safety space here. But SIFp, we use this language SIFp as an acronym. Serious injury or fatality is what it stands for, and there's some quite specific fatality. It's a difficult thing to sort of have shades of grey around. It either is or it isn't, unfortunately. But a serious injury itself is actually there's quite a continuum there in terms of what people would consider to be a serious injury. We've got some quite specific parameters around what does a serious actual injury look like. Life-threatening, life-altering is the key kind of language here. So it does set the bar fairly high for what a serious injury is. Now, these events in the top of the triangle here, they don't happen very often. These are the actual serious events. When they do, it's generally a pretty big shock. We sometimes refer to them as SIFp actuals or SIFp A. But when we talk about SIFp P, the P is about potential, and they happen much more frequently. Much more frequently. I would say probably I'd estimate at least on the 100 to 1. Possibly more. We haven't actually done any analysis on that, but my gut tells me that it's at least at that scale. So there's a lot of learning opportunity from those 100 incidents to stop the 1 from occurring. And obviously that relationship is different depending upon the risk, the specific kind of risk we're talking about. Now, the key point about SIFp or hypo events is that they could come from anywhere up and down this triangle. And near misses, in fact, actually have a much higher concentration of SIFp potential events than normal reported incidents, that don't fall into the near miss category, which is kind of interesting. It clearly means that workers, when they do report a near miss, it's usually because they felt like we should take it pretty seriously. The research is focused on the events that sit in the smaller triangle. So we're actually only really looking at that slice, which is the 10 to 20% of broader incidents in our database. Now, a few of them might involve injuries. Most of them don't, actually. They almost always involve a critical control failure of some kind. And frontline workers are usually likely to appreciate their significance when you talk to them about it. Now, as I said, 10 to 20%, it's quite variable. That's what we call a SIFp exposure rate. It's the division of SIFp potential events divided by your total incidents. And because we know that it's a fairly rubbery classification process for organisations within their own safety management system, we don't get too hung up on the SIFp exposure rate as a benchmark. But what we do know is between that 10 and 20% mark is probably what you could expect in most cases.
Yeah, sure. So look, I think that's a pretty good baselining. So hopefully that makes sense for everyone. And if it doesn't, or if you've got some more questions, please drop them into the chat as well. So the so what factor is probably the important thing in terms of why even bother looking at SIFp potential events. And so for us, there was, what's the implication for organisations is pretty key. I mean, we did some comparisons of just our data in terms of the risk categories. And of course, we've got pretty good data in terms of the actual controls that were ineffective under these risk categories. But if you roll up the data down to align with what SafeWork Australia's published as their most recent fatality data, there's some pretty good indicators in terms of why you should even be concerned with SIFp potential. What are your thoughts on that, Was?
Yeah, it was kind of fortunate that it comes out this way because otherwise, if there wasn't some sort of correlation or statistical relationship between these two data sets that you see on the screen, I'm not sure we'd be having this webinar right now because we've always felt that the more SIFp potential incidents you have, the closer you are to having an actual serious injury or fatality. And this data does tend to bear that out. There is actually a reasonably strong linkage between the higher concentrations of gravity-related fatalities and motor vehicle or mobile equipment, I'd say slightly more generally, because there are a couple of other classifications in the Safe Work Australia data that sort of fit into that. And there's a very good relationship between that and what we see in our own data around assessing SIFp potential events, which of course are far greater in number than the actual fatalities that occur. So what we'd say, look, not shining an accurate light on those SIFp potential events is going to mean that you're missing the opportunity to do something about them before they actually turn particularly ugly. I mean, as I say, most of these are near misses. They're generally benign outcomes, SIFp potential events I'm talking about. However, really, I suppose we used to say, if not for luck, this could have turned very, very bad. And the only distinction between the actual serious event and the potential serious event was that variable, which is luck. But look, the upside of getting it right, and I think it's important to talk about upside rather than downside, by seeing and noticing and drilling into SIFp potential events more accurately and more fulsomely, weak signals to failure, they're much less likely to be ignored. You'll be able to allocate your investigation resources, in a much more targeted way. Learning from those failures, it's more likely to be comprehensive if you're actually applying an investigation rather than just an incident report, to an event. And of course, critical control improvements are more likely to get attention. And we know that if you do that, if you give constructive attention to your control framework, serious incident frequency is far more likely to go down.
Yeah, we've certainly seen by looking at through the lens of SIFp potential, it actually gives you a good sense of how reliable or effective your controls are in the critical risks that are actually on your radar. And so, well, let's unpack that a bit further, because I've got a few more questions around definitions, which is actually another good segue.
Yeah.
So, and this is a fairly poignant photo and it reminds me of when I did my Achilles and I had my foot in a cast about 6-7 months ago. But that's actually not my foot, clearly.
I've never had a broken bone, Alex, so at least of all a broken ankle. But you can see here that this is a pretty nasty injury. And look, for most organisations, this is not going to get unnoticed. It's not going to go unnoticed. It's going to get a lot of attention. Anything that requires hospitalisation and this kind of treatment is going to be considered fairly seriously. And it's going to involve lost time. It's certainly going to involve some pain and suffering for the worker, in this case. I've got to say, though, this is much less likely to be life-threatening or life-altering. This is the kind of injury that for the vast majority of people, they're going to come back from, in fact, in probably not that long a period of time. In fact, they may be on restricted duties, almost just a few days afterwards. So we wouldn't consider this in itself a SIFp actual, a serious injury or fatality actual event. But what we'll be interested in is it a SIFp potential event? So if you have a look at incident 1, which is the scenario that produced this broken ankle, ask yourself the question, would you consider this to have been the worst thing that could have happened to this worker given that scenario? And I'll just give you a couple of seconds to reflect on that.
In fact, there's a question that's popped up around notification of serious injuries to regulators, and how does that kind of compare and contrast to SIFp potential? So I would anticipate the first one was possibly, depending on the context, would actually be a reportable incident potentially. But then to your point, is that one and the same as a SIFp potential?
Yeah.
If one or two things were to change, and is there a credible outcome that could have occurred if something was to become a bit more sinister?
Yeah, and I know that the regulator has become more and more attuned in the last 10 to 15 years to the concept of potential, and less just single focused on actual. But you can see here that first incident scenario, I'd suggest that's probably about the worst it could have been. In fact, I reckon this worker was probably quite unlucky, for it to be even this severe. Most of us, we might have a rolled ankle, we may not have broken it in this situation. Incident number 2, though, same outcome. The picture relates almost perfectly to that particular scenario. But I'd like you to consider, everybody on this, who's participating in this webinar, would you, if you ask yourself the same question, what would you think about the potential for this particular scenario? And obviously, we are now talking about definite potential for fatality. Only one very small thing would have had to have changed, for this person to be, to really suffer quite badly. In fact, have the worst outcome. What we found is that for many organisations, these two scenarios might actually get treated the same way in terms of response to them, because that's where the outcome focus that dominates can cause a real problem in terms of not visualising the worst that could have happened rather than just what actually did happen. So I suppose that leads to a question: is how do we determine potential? Because that's a fairly rubbery exercise. It's like assessing risk, through a risk matrix lens, which we would say is an equally unreliable process.
Let's not go down that. That hole, that's a whole other webinar in itself. But
it is.
Let's jump into a bit more detail, because I think there's a few questions here around how do we determine SIFp potential.
This is still setting the scene for, we think it's important that you understand how our thinking process works, in order that the data we're about to show you later, at least it will have some credibility for you. Now this is quite simplified. For the sake of seeing something on a screen, on a slide, we've obviously kept this pretty simple. The risk test is interesting in the sense that that's our first step. We've got to have some sort of critical risk situation, and that's our first kind of doorway we walk through. If we don't have a critical risk context for the event, generally speaking, it turns to a no, and we would pass all this off into low consequence. Now, when I say critical risk, there's a bit of nuance to that, because when it comes to each of these risks, you need some very specific technical parameters, descriptions about what constitutes that risk turning bad. When it comes to, like every operating context is different, and that means controls are generally a bit specialised, and many of those risks actually have different characteristics. We might be talking fall from height, but it'll be very different for a scaffolding firm than it will be somebody who does roofing, as an example. Like the controls will be different, the heights that they're operating.
The operating context will be different too.
So just an example: truck movement and forklift movement. Somewhat similar risks. We've got mobile equipment interacting with pedestrians and other equipment, but they manifest completely at different speeds, in different spaces, and in different ways. And so you've got to be really specific about what your parameters would be about what does a forklift movement that's unsafe look like. And look, another example might be if you've got a pair of safety glasses that drop from, first level of a scaffold platform, compared with a 2 kilo shifter that I drop, unfortunately, out of my hand from 5 levels of a scaffold. There's a very, very big difference in those two outcomes. They're both falling objects, but we want to draw a line where we consider that the actual risk has tipped into kind of a red zone. And obviously the next test is, well, we're asking ourselves, if only one thing changed, could this event have credibly resulted in something very serious? The key word being credibly. And that one thing has to have a degree of probability to occur. And sometimes we can test that quite accurately with just looking at prior incidents and near misses, because it tells us how frequently these events actually happen. If we just bring up the last point for this, Alex.
Sure.
So the probability test is the key last step. And this is about assessing how likely it is for that one change to occur. We know that people, if they're regularly under the scaffold and it doesn't have a barricade, then it's a pretty easy decision. We know that drop shifter, has a very high chance. In fact, some people would say if it's busy enough under that scaffold, then we're just lucky that it didn't actually hit somebody. If there's a very good barricade around that scaffold and entry to it or entry within it is actually quite difficult, then it's much, much less likely. So they're the kinds of things that we're looking at in the incident report. We're trying to ascertain that likelihood factor with as much confidence as we can. Now, that's never going to be perfect. It's still a judgment call, but that judgment call is informed at least with a structured approach to it. So key things, just before we go forward, just the key things to consider. each critical risk, you've got to have enough specific detail to make that yes/no call in the first place, like weight, height, speed, etc. The one-if test, look, it's going to prompt a bit of debate sometimes. I've got to say, if that debate goes for more than 5 minutes, it's low potential.
Mm-hmm.
And the probability test, that last test, you've got to have a solid understanding about the operational kind of environment that you're making an assessment about an incident that has happened in that operational environment. If you don't know the operational environment or can't picture the work or picture the task, it's going to be hard to make that call.
Yeah,
Thanks,
absolutely.
Alex.
And look, there's obviously more to it than this, because I think at a very high level, that's a really good explanation. And I think some organisations do this in a very mature manner, and they've got all sorts of sophisticated tools, and we've seen and developed decision trees that help enable them to apply this thinking in their operating context. But I think for others, it's possibly new. So let's jump into the data. And probably the key thing is what is our research telling us about SIFp classification more broadly speaking? So
Sure.
Yeah,
you might remember, Alex. You might remember, Alex. I said 16% kind of success rate, which is a very low success rate, 1 in 6, and that's probably our primary and probably more surprising finding. We had no idea it was going to be consistently that inaccurate. And you could say, well, it's only inaccurate compared to our own framework. We've got some fairly high confidence that we don't assess incidents as serious potential very easily. Like we are really looking at those with legitimate potential for a bad outcome. So in this case, we're talking about major and catastrophic. Now, this five-point scale, I've got to say, that's what was really interesting to us is that almost all the organisations we work with over the last 4 or 5 years have some kind of 5-point scale. I think 1 or 2 had a kind of a risk matrix approach, but most actually had this kind of framework, slightly different language. And we're looking at the major catastrophic category that they have classified the events as, and comparing it then to our assessment of SIFp potential events. And this is where we get the 1 in 6 accuracy. 5 out of 6 somehow landed in moderate, minor, or negligible, and surprisingly, like a large number in negligible. And the second finding was fascinating, because on the other side of the coin, we're seeing that more than half of the incidents that were rated as serious and deserving of a deep dive investigation and probably lots of gnashing of teeth, half of them weren't SIFp potential at all. They were probably like the photo we saw recently, just now, of the person with the broken ankle. That was in one of those scenarios was never going to be any worse than what it was. And sure, it would demand some form of investigation, but should it be, given a real red flag, as a potentially serious event? No. So those 2 findings are quite interesting. But let's have a look at the implications of that, Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that example you had of the shifter falling through, we've seen a lot of that in even just hazard reporting. And so going back to the data cleansing, if you like, it's what one organisation or an individual calls an incident is different to what another individual calls it, right? So that could potentially be one of the reasons as to why it's being classified lower, if you like. But in terms of the data set here, let's jump into this. So this data here is actually, this is pretty, we might take a few minutes to just unpack this. So you've got classification categories on the left-hand side, and then the magnitude of where people or those organisations, how they classified those SIFp potential incidents. Do you want to unpack this on a bit further, Waz?
Sure. This is the breakdown of what we just saw. For those who are interested, like how frequently were incidents in the lowest possible rating actually probably serious enough for them to have taken more seriously, and that's it's a relatively small percentage, but that's actually a large number of incidents. In that little black bar on the top bar, it's it doesn't look like very many, but there should have been 0. We would say that ideally there would be 0 in any one of those top 3 classifications, and all of the SIFp potential events would more accurately find their way into the into the major or catastrophic. And that's the work we're doing with quite a few organisations, is to help them to just get a little bit better at this, where they're missing less of those incidents. Now, obviously, the cost is pretty obvious. And the cost is obvious on both sides of the fence. There's a lot of extra resource or misdirected resource in investigations for the incidents that are rated serious but probably aren't. And of course, on the other side of the fence, all those events, which is the majority, the 5 out of 6 that we would consider to be deserving of further investigation, are much less likely to do so, which means a massive loss of learning opportunity, for those organisations. I mean, of course, there's also the issue of, like, so many organisations use SIFp potential events and the frequency of them as a proxy for a safety metric. Now, it's a bit unfortunate when that happens, because we have the same old classification kind of bias influences happening when you've got something like that potentially driving people's decisions. But look, governance is a big issue in safety. And of course, it's prejudiced massively if you're looking at data that isn't actually really accurately telling you the story.
And
my
reflection,
sorry, go on, Alex.
On this is exactly to that point. Sorry, is that leaders in organisations and executives and even boards. So sometimes we do assurance work where we're independently reviewing the data sets from a reporting perspective. Quite often there's that gnashing of there's different drivers in the organisation and biases, and so I think one of the questions that come through around KPIs around recordables, things like that. I feel that's we've certainly experienced that. The misconception or the different perspectives around how an incident should be categorized sometimes comes down to KPIs, but more often than not, the system's been designed and architected in a way that it's not nuanced enough to kind of pick up those SIFp potential kind of events, right? And there's a number of different reasons around that as well. But just in terms of, if you're an officer in an organization or an executive, I mean, how are you meant to even discharge your duties effectively when you're relying on data that's presented to you, and your ability to actually provide necessary resources and decision making around managing your risks is kind of hampered by the reliability of data, right?
Absolutely.
So let's just throw it back to the
participants.
The participants, yeah. So I think, Holly, if you don't mind, let's just throw up this poll just to get a sense of what resonates with you around the conversation so far, and what issues are you seeing, both classification of incident severity and also what prompts the decision to investigate. So you can access the poll either on your screen, hopefully, if the tech works, or there should be a QR code that you can kind of click on and then link into as well. And if
Alex, you and I can't participate, unfortunately.
Well, we can't. And if the tech doesn't work, just put your response into the chat. That should be good enough. So for those of you on the call, the first one is only incidents that impact safety metrics get attention. So probably to the question that came up in the question chat. Number 2, assessment of incident potential is influenced by personal bias. Number 3, incident outcome, not potential, determines the choice. Which we do see in a lot of organisations, probably the more mature organisations. The risk matrix fails to produce accurate or consistent assessment. We've got limited investigation resources. All of the above, and maybe none of them. So if it does become none of those resonate with you, just drop a note in the chat, because that could be the other category that we haven't kind of channeled you into. So give that another 30 seconds and let's weigh it up. But it looks like, the horses are bolting, and it looks like there's a bit of a theme here around assessment of incident potential is influenced by personal bias, seems to be the most topical here. Maybe we can end the poll, Holly, and share the results.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Excellent. There we go. So I'm assuming everyone can see this, but it looks like assessment of incident potential is influenced by personal bias. Which is certainly a pattern that we've seen, Warren, when we're doing those board assurance reviews. Either the organisation hasn't set up those people who do the classification up for success because their governance standards dictate a particular kind of reporting, or you're potentially in the reporting line. You're reporting up into an organisational structure that has its own influences on classification, or you just don't know any better.
We've found, Alex, that those organisations that get it right, or get it more right, are the ones that, first of all, they actually design a structured approach to it, and they have a limited number of people actually making the call on it, who can calibrate with each other over time, so that they can maintain consistency, because obviously the minute you start putting these numbers up as some sort of safety metric, and look, it is a useful safety metric as long as nothing else is attached to it. You want to be able to feel like you're actually consistently assessing it over time.
Excellent. Well, let's jump into more data. So thank you for responding on those, for those of you who did. Jumping into this set of data, this is quite revealing for us. And so maybe let's just talk to the structure of the data to start with. The y-axis is around the integrity or the rating that the organization had on SIFp potential. So what was the lens that they looked at, and how accurately did they classify SIFp potential compared to the way we would look at that classification? And then on the y-axis, the profile in terms of risk category, so critical risks that were most prevalent in that data set. The green line is the magnitude of events that were experienced within those risk categories, if that makes sense. So this is probably subject to more research, I suspect, but there's probably more to it than just landing on the fact that the more you misclassify, the more likely it is to experience a SIFp event. But there's probably more to that you want to.
Yeah, I'd add something to that, because look, that could be one interpretation, and certainly you could draw a trend out of that, or some sort of loose correlation. I think the big issue here is, of course, that there's a lot more exposure for certain risks in most businesses than there are other risks. So like obviously motor vehicle gravity related events, management of uncontrolled energy, those kinds of things, they tend to exist in much higher volume, for most high hazard organizations than, say, strange ones like risk of drowning, as an example, or there's probably others that are that are similar. It's interesting, confined space, one of the best controlled risks in general terms. Hardly any incidents actually occur in our data set, or very small number, and generally anything does go wrong, it gets much more attention, as an example. But when it comes to uncontrolled energy, motor vehicle, falling objects is a really interesting one. There's a lot more rubberiness around. In fact, sometimes things just don't even get reported beyond just a very, very simple "it happened," and that's all. We don't see any kind of further work done on a lot of motor vehicle incidents, even though our feeling is, oh boy, that was actually fairly serious. Trailers disconnecting, as an example. So many of them don't even get reported, and the organisations we work with tell us this. But when they do, they don't get treated particularly seriously, as an example. Emergency avoidance of a large animal on the highway, as an example. That can cause some serious problems with vehicle rollovers and so forth, but would barely get a mention in terms of the serious end of incidents. So I think there's some interesting things in this. We need to tease this out a little more as to what sits under each of these. Some certainly familiarity with the risk, or maybe even the behavioural nature of the activity and the controls that are meant to be deployed. When they're really, really behavioural, like motor vehicle, it's like it's down to me and my decisions and my actions, rather than using a piece of equipment. It's that they do tend to sort of fall under the radar a lot more and treated like it's just the cost of doing business. They're my interpretations, Alex.
Yeah, sure. And look, I mean, there's clearly a bit more to tease out of this. I think in the interest of time, I might keep moving.
Sure.
Look, if you've got any questions on this slide of data, please pop it into the chat as well. So I think we'll just kind of wrap up, because there's a fair few questions that have come through in the Q&A that we want to spend some time, pay homage to. So in terms of key takeaways from this slice of the data set or the research, probably the key thing is that reviewing your classification system is actually pretty key, because I think objectively reviewing it, because it is subject to cognitive bias, it's subject to structural bias, it's subject to so many different kind of aspects and influences. And so just calibrating the way you'll classify your high severity incidents is pretty key. But of those, knowing which ones have got high potential is also pretty important. So there's obviously a complexity in that decision tree process that you presented because it depends on the operating context and a whole bunch of other factors. But I think that is pretty key. to distinguishing between a SIFp potential and a non-SIFp potential. And that's not to suggest that you don't pay attention or do anything in response to the non-SIFp potential events. So those low consequence, high severity, high frequency incidents just require a different control strategy, so to speak. And that goes to probably balancing the proportionate level of effort that you put into responding and investigating to low risk events, if you like, or low severity, that should read, as distinct from high severity incidents as well. Clearly the data is kicking up a lot of incidents or risk categories that kind of go under the radar. And that may be a familiarity kind of bias, or just maybe just the fact that some organizations are more exposed to mobile equipment or motor vehicle, but that seems to be under the radar considerably across the data set as well. And that's not to say that there's other risks that need to be focused on. So I was looking at the aggregate data set, and there's a lot of working at heights and falling objects and working under suspended loads and cranes. But that we separate those risks. In some organizations, they're either off the radar, or even things like insect bites and snakes and things like that. So we've certainly seen in some operating contexts there's a prevalence of those, but they're seen as being a hazard or a low severity kind of outcome. And then clearly getting a sense of how reliable is our classification, and go to anyone else in this space who've understood how to reliably classify incidents from a SIFp perspective is pretty key as well. So look, before we jump into Q&A, I might just throw a nod to the fact that we've got another webinar coming up. So we've got the likes of Anthony Deacon, Don Martin, and Trish Karen, who are very well known in this space, in their industry specialisms, but also from a global perspective. So grab the QR code, or just note to self that that webinar's coming up, and that should be pretty insightful. And given the expertise in the room, I'd encourage you to jump on that one as well. So QR code, or just note the webinar when it comes up on our socials as well. If you do want to dive in a bit deeper on our diagnostic tools, just write yes in the chat, or better still, just use the QR code to get a bit of time one-on-one. Just even share your journey in terms of what you're doing, because I think for data nuts like ourselves, we love just understanding and unpacking the way people approach this kind of work.
Yeah, even if there's a question that you feel like you're just busting to have a discussion about that we don't discuss today, just book some Calendly time with me, because I'd love to have a chat with you.
Excellent. Let's jump into Q&A. There is a truckload of questions coming through. So, so if you'd like to ask a question, please jump on the Q&A. There's a Q&A link or a button that you need to click onto. And if you click on that, it'll give you the option to present a question. But I might just start with, I've got 4 or 5 here.
It's just in the chat, Alex, isn't it? It's just the chat.
Yeah, correct. So you can put it in the chat, but there's also Q&A.
Oh, is there?
As well. Right. But I think I've only just realised that myself. So questions. Okay, all right. So can you tell us more about the analysis method that was mentioned in the white paper? So I think that's pointing to the scale. So
Sure.
we've only shared a part of the analysis method, which you kind of talked through, but there's quite there's more to it.
And I can give a very quick thumbnail sketch of that for those who are interested. Look, obviously first, we're going to review the incident report summary. We're just looking at, is this obviously a SIFp potential situation? And we're running it through our, where there's enough, kind of clarity about the event. We want to know the risk category as well. So is it serious, not serious? Is there a question mark against it? Where we'll go back to the organisation and actually get clarity on a lot of instances, probably about 15 to 20%, we actually had to get more clarity. So we do try to test quite hard that first step. Short list of SIFp potential incidents. We come up with that short list, which is that between that 10 and 20%, as we mentioned. We review the full investigation outputs then, which is usually a number of documents. Could be photos, could be, like sometimes, the corrective actions that are actually recommended are in a completely different database to the, to the actual findings. We're looking at the controls that would be expected to be implemented that were either absent or poorly implemented in each of those events. Now, sometimes we will establish our own view about what control could have been in place that probably should have been. Sometimes the organisation provides us with their control framework to look through that lens. Now, when we work through, a structured analysis of the human, operational, and organisational influences. That's a bit of a decision tree in itself, and we've got quite a large taxonomy there that you would probably expect to see in terms of those influencing factors that could come to bear, on that event. And then we package it all up, in a Power BI dashboard, for our clients. That's what we. That's our general approach. There's a lot more to it than just those 5 or 6 points, though.
Well, there's probably about 7 or 8 different diagnostic tools that all leverage off that model. But yeah, it's plenty on the website, and happy to chat. Probably a nod to the fact that there is an e-learning course being launched next week or the week after that walks you through the methodology, so you can actually get an appreciation of the deeper analysis technique. But we'll talk about that in due course. How did you extract sufficient information out of incident reports that are relatively flimsy? Love it. So this is probably not to the start of the conversation where we had the 10,000 and then found that they were relatively flimsy or didn't have sufficient information to warrant a deeper dive. And so we went from 10,000 to 5,091, and then the deeper dive on about 680 of those where there was actually sufficient information. And so there's probably 2 things here. One is going through the process of diligently cleansing out the data so you're left with something reliable. The other piece of it is that when you're looking at the blunt end factors, we also have a methodology where we try to avoid any kind of rubbery conclusions as to upstream factors. And quite often there's still insufficient information to even give us a sense of the organisational factors or the operational factors upstream of the actual event. So we focus on controls that are absent and ineffective. You always know there's a human involved because they're typically the occupational injuries that present themselves. But as soon as you start getting a bit more upstream of that, then it's starting to become relatively, more blunt end, if you like. Anything you want to add to that, Wes?
Yeah, I'd say though that it's I think for any of us that've got a fairly solid background in critical risk management, or we understand how operations function, especially if we've been in the field a bit, we can draw some fairly confident conclusions even when something isn't specifically mentioned in an investigation report. And you can be guaranteed that those kinds of factors are rarely ever mentioned in investigation reports. It's something that's like common across pretty much all industries. The vast majority of incident investigations don't go much further back than, was it an equipment failure? Was it a human issue, a human problem, a human error issue? And what's the combination of that? And then not many more questions are asked when it comes to finalising one's conclusions. So we are able to see the context, we are able to see what was involved, and we're able to draw some fairly confident conclusions about what upstream factors, in a lot of cases, would likely have been relevant. But it's only when we've got high confidence that we do.
Yeah, sure. Another question's just popped in. I've got about 5 more, so we may run out of time. But have you discovered any themes around risk culture that underpins root causes for SIFp potential? Brilliant question. Do you want to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, I think
there's different layers to that one, isn't there?
That's right. There's some general responses to that I think anybody who've kind of wrapped their head around safety culture and how safety culture influences performance. With SIFp potential specifically, it's organisations that don't make particularly strong distinctions between events. I think that's one of the key things when they're only focused on outcome, and if it's fairly benign, it's just off I go. We're fine. We're all good. I think the issue is also where controls aren't perceived to be particularly seriously important in organisations, and there's a bit of a lax attitude toward verifying that work is done as it should be done. And then if it's not being done as it should be done, actually asking a really a thorough explorative conversation rather than a slap on the wrist about why that's the case, because not all controls can be implemented as you would expect in the field. But organisations that don't do any of that stuff and really have a lax attitude toward it, we find that it tends to flow into behaviour as well. That's just a couple of things off the cuff. I mean, there's probably a lot more. Really good question.
That's a great question. That's probably the subject of a whole new webinar. So there's about 3 more, but I might just pick on 1 or 2 of those.
Yep.
I don't know if you can see these was, but there's one here that talks about, is gravity also dominant because they're an aggregate of multiple risks? Do you have a recommendation on how to break
Absolutely.
that down?
Yes, that great question. Look, yeah, we roll up. We only roll this up when we're talking about it more generically, because it does have similar, like there are sort of kind of similar kinds of controls that overlap with each other. Fall from height, falling object, suspended load. Some people would bundle suspended load and cranes and lifting together. We probably wouldn't, because obviously, a crane is a very specific type of mechanical object, has its own kind of mechanical issues, and which can go wrong. We would say that the biggest fail point for most organisations is that the fall from height and falling object gets rolled up together, and they aren't the same. They've got entirely different control kind of systems. Kind of looks the same.
Yeah.
We're up high, but that's about the only commonality. And a very large number of falling objects don't make it on the serious radar, which should. Whereas fall from height, less likely to. Fall from height issues are generally, there's a lot more kind of attention placed on anything that's got fall from height smell about it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, look, yeah, brilliant questions. And there's about 2 or 3 more, but what we'll do is we'll probably roll them into the next webinar or respond to individuals specifically on their questions as well. But look, thank you very much. It's the top of the hour, and appreciate everyone spending a bit of time with us. And we're pretty excited to unveil the rest of the research, and that'll come through in the next couple of months. So thank you and good afternoon.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks everybody for joining us.